The Baptist and the Buddhist are Mark and Brian, identical twin brothers with two vastly different faiths. Join them as they explore their respective religions through dialogue and discussion. Same DNA, different religions.
Hey everyone, this is the Baptist
and the Buddhist
with Mark
and Brian
And Brittany.
and our
and
special
Brittany's
guest
in the
Brittany.
background. Yes.
We
This
have
is
a live audience.
a live audience. Yeah, that's exciting. We're on episode 5.
I can't believe it.
Yeah, me neither. And there's more to come. I think we've kind of laid a really good foundation so far of like basic beliefs. But you and I were talking right before the show, and
Like we
I
always
think
do.
this is the foundational episode for, you said for Buddhism, I believe for my side as well, for the Christian Baptist side of things as well. I think this is like the reason, for me at least, the reason this belief system exists.
Yeah, this is the ideas that we're talking about today are like at the core of why Buddhism is.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so like
Exactly.
the previous episodes have been somewhat foundational in understanding where we're coming from, but like this episode is delving deep, like drilling deep to the core of why Buddhism and why Christianity, like what is this about, you know?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, not to hold the suspense any longer. I mean, we're talking about, even though they've probably seen the
Like,
episode
yeah,
title
the
already,
titles are up there and stuff. And
or down there or something. Yeah, we're talking about, well, initially we were like, let's do an episode on like sin or dukkha or whatever the belief system sees as like a negative attribute to like humanity. And I'm like, well, I can't do that without the other side of it, which is like the redemption part from the negative. So like the salvation or redemption side of things. So it's going to be kind of a 2-in-1. You get 2 topics for the price of 1.
yeah, it's, you know, the idea of liberation and, you know, contrasted to dukkha or suffering. It's like you literally can't have liberation without dukkha. It's
Right,
just
exactly.
if there wasn't one, then there wouldn't be the other.
Right. And I'm kind of interested to see the contrast between, like, because when we brought up this episode before in planning this, it's like, yeah, we'll do an episode on sin and dukkha, and they're probably not the same thing, obviously.
No.
So I'm interested to see the contrast in the two, and the comparisons as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think um kind of as an introduction to the idea, and kind of a comparison, just kind of an anecdotal comparison, honestly. Um, so there's like these kind of questionable etymological explanations of sin and dukkha, and I don't think either of the two are very like either of the two etymologies. They're kind of apocryphal in a sense that I don't know how foundational, like how rooted in truth they are, but like, so there's the idea that gets floated around that sin is like can be translated as like missing the mark, um and maybe that's way completely off, but that's what that's what I hear sometimes floated around. And dukkha sometimes is also translated as a wheel off, like a wheel with an off-centered axle. So it's this very uneasy, not pleasant thing. And I think both of them kind of have this idea of just missing, just not being quite right of something.
Yeah,
In a very vague
I'll mention the one verse that it talks about that, and it, since I use like, I'm strictly like a King James Bible guy, like other translations will say in this verse, um, like, uh, all it talks about how, I'm just going to paraphrase it. It talks about how all men are sinners, and fall short of the glory of God, but like the King James says, come short of the glory of God. There's kind of a different, like if you look into it hard enough, there's kind of a difference between the two wordings, but definitely like there is that like falling short of the mark, as you said earlier. So I think, yeah, that the loose wheel or whatever was kind of a good analogy.
Yeah, I mean they're poetic and very colorful, like kind of analogies. Maybe not completely, they may miss the mark as well
Right.
in
Yeah.
explaining exactly what we're talking about. So
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that. And I mean, I guess I'll get into it from my side. Um, so we're talking about sin from a Christian standpoint, and I'm going to kind of go exactly from my perspective, which is, not the standard, umbrella Christian belief. Which I mean, I think as the Christians side with the fundamentals, it's going to be the same thing. But I think some other people within the umbrella of Christianity might like disagree with, possibly, but I don't know about that. Well, let's see. Like, what is sin? And I'm like, okay, what, like, how do I define sin in a Christian world in like a sentence or two, like in a phrase? And the one that I keep coming back to is a transgression of God's law. But like, what does that even mean? Like, when it comes down to it, what does that mean? And really, like, in from a Christian point of view, the universe is at the mercy of God's will and God's character, and like, there's nothing that has been made that wasn't made by him, and everything under the umbrella of this created universe is from his hands. And there's obviously the whole issue of sin. So like, what does that mean within God's realm of his creation and everything? And like, what the transgression from his laws, I guess, like, a good way to describe it is, what exactly, like, where did sin come from? Like, what is this thing? So in like in a timeline kind of a view, we see sin entering with Lucifer's fall. Lucifer was that archangel. He was actually like the highest archangel in the angelic realm. And we'll talk about like exactly what all this means in another episode, which I'm like fascinated by angelology and like the cosmology of like the biblical universe, or reality, if you will. Um, but so Lucifer was this archangel created by God. He was the covering cherub. He was this cherub that was actually covering God's throne. As you see in the Bible, there are 4 cherubs that surround his throne, covering him with their wings, basically shielding everyone from his light, his glory. And Lucifer was the covering cherub. And Lucifer sinned. Like, what is that? And I kind of want to, like, for some reason, I feel like I want to ask you this. Like, what was Lucifer's sin? And like boiled down, like, what was it? Like, do you have an idea?
I think the pat answer usually is pride.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. It was his pride. Um, what was his sin, really? Well, he wanted to be God. He wanted to be like the Most High. Um, Lucifer wanted to exalt his throne above God's throne. And being a creation of God, that's not really a possibility. But he still wants to do that because of his pride, because of his beauty. His beauty was his pride, and he thought he was all that. So he wanted to exalt himself above the actual creator, above the Almighty, which was a sin because he's putting himself above God, before God, which we'll see in the Ten Commandments. That's one of the foundational laws that God gave man. So Lucifer fell. God judged that, and there were huge ramifications. Lucifer actually took his idea and basically advertised it to the rest of the angelic realm. And he took, according to Revelations, he took a third of the angels with him. And we know there's at least 100 million angels, if not more, because that's the highest number the Bible gives us is 100 million angels, but there's probably more than that. So he took those with him, and they sinned, and in their sin, uh, they were kicked out of God's realm, the third heaven. They were kicked out of heaven, and the sin that he committed and brought the other angels with him. When God created man, Satan, or Lucifer, his fallen state is called Satan. He advertises his plan and his will to the first created beings, Adam and Eve, and they took the bait. And that bait was to not listen to God. Basically, like Satan had uh, like a threefold kind of deal with God's words. He will question it, and he will deny it, and he will change it. And you see that in the serpent's conversation with Eve in the book of Genesis. There's that like threefold plan there. And with the with Lucifer's sin, the angel sin, now this newly created species of man has taken the bait and fallen in their pride, basically. And with being convinced, that brought sin into man's nature. And what is sin in that perspective? That's basically, I've heard this analogy a long time ago, and it's always kind of stuck with me, because we see God, he's holy, he's I don't want to say perfect, because perfect doesn't mean sinless in the Bible. Perfect has a different definition, but God is he's like the standard of moral excellence. So the absence of that standard is what sin is. It's like darkness is basically just without light. It's the absence of light. Cold is the absence of heat. So sin is the absence of the moral excellence of God, the Almighty Creator. Yes.
So would the moral excellence of God, like you use the shadow analogy, would the moral of excellence of God like necessitate the existence of sin? Like is sin unavoidable in that context?
No, not necessarily, because with God's creation, it's a possibility that sin exists, and it's kind of inevitable. And like with God's like all-knowing, like timeless knowledge, like he knew it was going to happen. And that's why he made some plans that were hidden God from the foundation of the world until it was revealed later, because he knew things were going to happen. He had this exact way to plan it all out. But with the existence of sin, it's not a necessity, because God made the angelic realm, that spiritual realm, those beings there with a free will. He gave man that same free will, and that free will was the opportunity to choose. Lucifer obviously did not choose in the right way, and it wasn't that he didn't know the ramifications, and it's not that Adam and Eve didn't know the ramifications, but instead of controlling themselves, which it all comes down to an like a minded a minded life, a mindful life. Like you
It's
have to think
relatable.
it through. Huh?
That's relatable.
Exactly, exactly. Um, and I don't think a lot of Christians really like realize that. But
Mm.
when it comes to the mind, it's very important, especially in the age of grace that we're in now. Like the mind is such a huge thing. We'll get to that. Um, but we're all given a choice, and y- I don't know if the angelic realm was given this option, but in every age of history, man is given a choice, and man is given basically a way out if they make the wrong choice. There's always a way to redeem themselves,
A
or
fail safe, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah, basically, yeah, the fail safe. Um, so I think that kind of defines sin. I have some more stuff to go on to, but I think that defines sin. Does that make sense, or is there any question left open? I'm kind of like really trying to just boil it down.
Yeah.
I mean, I could touch on a few other things like the Ten Commandments and stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the only question that came to mind was like you had mentioned the commandment that Lucifer had basically like broken or whatever, um, of putting, what was it, no other god before
Yeah,
him.
no other God before
And
God.
Lucifer tried that by putting himself. Um,
Yeah.
and so a question entered my mind is: are the angels given the same commandments as man?
That's a good question. And really, we know very little, like, very little is revealed from the Bible of what the angels have been told. Um, I would venture to say that they knew the ramifications, or they knew what was right and what was wrong. Especially when you see that, like, when Lucifer is telling Adam and Eve, like, hey, if you eat of this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like gods. And the gods were the fallen angels, the gods, like gods with a little g, as they say, are angelic beings. And the inference of that is that they do know good and evil. So they do have that knowledge of what's good and what's bad. Like you know what's the right choice to make. And like with the whole idea of him being filled with his pride because of his beauty, like I think if he stopped to think, or if he knew if he was mindful of that fact, he wouldn't try to exalt his throne above God's, and he wouldn't be trying to be like the Most High and exalt himself above that. So I think there was a choice, and especially when Lucifer fell, I think the angels knew right away what was the ramification, because when you study it out, and this will come in the cosmology kind of portion of our study, but like when Lucifer fell, he God created hell for the angels. The Bible says hell was created for the devil and his angels. Like that was the sole purpose of hell. And when Lucifer fell, that was that was clear that, hey, this is this is not a good idea. And so that probably stopped some of the angels from following Lucifer's plan and Lucifer's his merchandise, as the Bible calls it. So there probably was some ramifications known, and they knew good and evil in the angelic realm. So, and clearly, like when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, God told them, don't eat from this tree. Like you can make that choice. There's a choice there. It's available to you, but don't eat of it or you'll die. And like, so they knew right away not to do that. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, you as you see through like the timeline of the Bible, God gives certain commandments to men. Not really like, hey, this is what you're supposed to do morally, a lot of the commandments to man were like, this is how you're going to deal with things. Like with the age of innocence, I'll just do a quick like synopsis. Age of innocence was, don't eat of this tree. They fell, so now it was their conscience. And like with Cain and Abel, it's like, hey, don't sin. And if you do, like if you do wrong, sin lieth at the door, as he says, as God tells him. And then that failed. Um, with I think that the failure there was with Cain and Abel. And he brings there's innocence, consciousness. There's like human government with Noah. It's like, okay, now you guys are gonna, like, you guys, like, mankind is gonna kind of govern themselves. So like if someone kills someone, eye for an eye kind of thing, like you guys are gonna kind of like deal with your crimes yourself. Like he gave them an order of human government. And then the promises to Abram, like if you do this, you will be blessed. If you do this, you will be blessed. And then the law of Moses, obviously, he lays out the 10 commandments. And that's not necessarily Jewish law, because Jewish law was the 470 other laws or whatever that he gave to them in the book of like Leviticus, telling them how to make it right. Because really, he wasn't telling them the 10 commandments is what you're going to do. He was basically saying the 10 commandments is what you're going to fail at doing. So here's how to fix it. And in the Jewish law and the Jewish religion, that's how they were to fix it. Do the sacrifices, do the offerings, how to dress, and how to, like, what not to eat, what not to wear, all that stuff. Which there were dietary laws before then anyways, but all of that, like I think the 10 commandments were really a way to show, like, if you think you're perfect, this is how you're going to measure yourself. And God never tells us to do something like to be right or else. He says this is how you would be right, but you're not going to be right because you're man. Because man sins just like Adam, just like Eve, just like Lucifer. So he always gives us a way out, be it sacrifices or the ultimate sacrifice, as we'll see.
That leads
But
us to the idea of salvation, right?
yeah, basically. But I do want to kind of I'll boil down sin a little bit more, because we need to lead up to the whole salvation point by, like, why do we need the salvation? Like, why do we need a redemption of sort, if like why do we need it? So like the Bible talks about how there's no one righteous, no one's sinless, except for, Jesus says that, the Bible says that God is sinless. Jesus is sinless. He never sinned. It talks about how man has sin. Man is like, every man's a sinner, and we have sin coursing through our blood. Like, we just have that sin nature in mankind. And because we have that sin nature, and that we are not sinless, and that every man that's born is a sinner, that, like, all sinners are destined for an eternity without God, and that's hell. Hell is just a temporary thing. It's actually the lake of fire is the eternal part. And it's like, oh no, that's horrible news. Like, that's really dumb. Like, why would we ever want to know that? Like, we're all sinners, and we all have a destiny that is without God. Like, that's pointless. But I mean, there's always the good news part of that, and that. Well, let me pull up this here real quick, because I said that everyone's a sinner, and mankind will always sin continuously, and the heart the heart of man is desperately wicked and uh, all of that. But Paul describes that, and he lays it out kind of cool because he lays it out with the law. He says, moreover, the law. Well, I'm reading from Romans 5. Let's see where I want to start. I think Paul kind of really does sum this whole thing of sin up really well. I just really want to know where to start first. Yeah, Romans 5:12. He says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, that's Adam, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." So he's basically saying because Adam was a sinner, all men are sinners, and we're all mortal men because of that, because we've all sinned and we're all sinners. And he says, "For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed. When there is no law, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned, after this similitude of Adam's transgressions, who is the figure of him that was to come." Let's see here. In verse 15, it says, "For if through the offense of one man, or one, many be dead, much more the grace of God and the gift by grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many." So he's basically saying sin by one man, Adam, but the gift of grace by one man, which is Jesus. And Jesus is called the last Adam, or the second Adam in the Bible. He's mentioned the last Adam was the title he was given because like he was the one to end what Adam started, basically. Um, Therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. And I think the verse that I'm trying to get to is verse 20. It says, "Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound." And what is this grace? This is the salvation part of sin, and salvation comes next. And that's grace. God has always shown grace through the ages. He's like, the law was given as a way out. That's his grace showing. But the the law was one, like the law and the Jewish law, or even before then, like the promises, that was one way God was giving them a way out. He didn't have to, but he did. But through this age, the age of grace, the mystery that was revealed to Paul was that Jesus died for all men, and that we can be fellow heirs of Christ, which is a kind of another topic, but that all men can be saved through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's the full dispensation of his grace. Like, it's never been fully dispensed that way, because before, sin was a kind of if and then thing, but now grace is freely given. Like, there is no if and then. It's just Jesus died for all. And all you have to do is stop if and thenning. Like, you don't have to do anything. You just have to remove your burden from like justifying yourself or trying to make yourself righteous, and trust in what Christ did. And I think I mentioned this before. I always saw that as an analogy of, like, say you are trying to bear your burdens like on your back. Okay, I'm just going to bear my own burdens. I'm going to take care of it myself. And God might have told Israel to do that. You bear your burdens, take care of it. Like, what you do will suffice. But now, instead of that, Jesus is like, "Hey, take off your burden, sit down for a second, let me do it." Like, you have to stop doing what you're doing to enable to trust him to take your burdens. So, like, I always see trust as a chair. Like, you sit down and let him do it. And really, trust I like the word trust so much because it has that connotation of bearing a load, like a truss of a house. The trusses are bearing the weight of the roof, the structure of the house. The trusses are what's holding it up. And that's what that trust does. So in this age of grace, yeah, I'm always going to talk about the dispensational aspect because it's so important in the Christian belief, even though some Christians might not believe in like dispensationalism or like rightly dividing the word of truth with like a Pauline dispensationalism. Like Paul is giving us the message for today, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it's Paul's epistles. No one can describe the salvation of the free salvation of through grace of Jesus Christ without going back to Paul's letters, because Jesus, John the Baptist, the apostles, the 12 apostles, they never described salvation that way. It was always repent and be baptized and believe in the name of Jesus Christ. That name was very important to Israel. The salvation was different for them. But through this day and age, salvation is freely given. Um, Paul describes in whom we have the redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. Those riches, I think he describes them somewhere else as the unsearchable riches of Christ. The unsearchableness because it was not searchable in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh or the Torah, or even the New Testament apostles. Like, you can't search that redemption out. And it's that the riches, those unsearchable riches, these riches of his grace, wherein he hath abounded towards us in all wisdom and prudence, having made known unto us the mystery of his will. And it goes into some dispensational stuff in there. I'm not going to touch on that right now. And he also describes it in like Colossians 2:13, you being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. It even talks about in the next verse how he got rid of the ordinances, the laws, like blotting out the handwriting of the ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. So that, like, looking at the law really condemned man. Like, that was the purpose of the law. It wasn't to make us righteous. It wasn't to make us redeemed. The law was really kind of an enemy to man. Like, like, we can't keep the law. That's impossible. Like, and Paul talks about that, how the law was against us and it was contrary to us. So the salvation from that sin was actually to get past the law and get to the grace of God giving you a way out. Because, well, I'll get to the why in a second. Romans 3:23, it's for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. And this one kind of defines what that means. The next verse says, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. So that forbearance of God showing that grace. Some more propitiation is like a big word that basically means like our replacement. And again, it talks about through faith in his blood. So very basic, like, what does this all mean? Like, sin is an unfortunate truth that like all men have to face. And that truth unfortunately separates us from God. Like, mankind is separated from God. I mean, that's kind of shown in the fallen nature of Lucifer and his angels, that they're separated, like they're physically separated from God, because God is in the highest heaven, but Satan is actually in this realm right now, in the second and the first heaven, earth and outer space. Um, so we can see that separation from God to man. But God didn't want it to be that way. God wants mankind, and God created mankind and angels to dwell with him. Like he created all of this to dwell with it. Like the whole purpose of his creation was to dwell with it and like be with it. And instead of forsaking his creation, he gave us a way out of it. And that was through the blood of himself. He sacrificed himself through that strange way of becoming a man, having that flesh and blood of man, but sinning not at all, but sacrificing himself as if he did anyways. And then somehow, like supernaturally, in the heart and the eyes of God, like that sacrifice was so spotless. So since there was no sin, there was no mark of negativity in that sacrifice, that was able to wash away all sins, because that was the basically the blood of God washing it all away. And through that, that frees up man for eternity, and we just have to stop striving for ourselves and rely on what God provided us. And it's all about relying on God, basically. So I think that kind of boils it down in a nutshell there. And I don't want to forget the fact that God did that in love, because he loves mankind. He loves his creation, and he loves man, like, specifically because man was designed for a specific reason, and he loves us. It's not just an arbitrary thing, but he does love people. He loves man, and you can see that through the life of Jesus being a man. And like, he loved the children, he loved the people, he loved the poor, the sinners, the weirdos. He loved everyone. And that's why he did it. And uh and that's really, like, there's one verse saying God is love, and he showed us the love through that. He doesn't want us to be uh, the sinners that we unfortunately are by nature.
Hmm.
And he knows we can't not be that, so he made a way out. that's that's the gist of my side.
Okay, so I think like the probably a simple nutshell, like very condensed nutshell, is like that the idea of like the trust thing, the putting like, you know, led kind of, I don't know if you would use the kind of wording of like letting that burden go, and like trusting that it would be taken care of, kind of.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly it.
Now,
And there's a refrain that you hear from a lot of like Christian circles. It's let go and let God. And they always say that about like your burdens, like, oh, I'm so worried about this. It's like, just let God handle it. But like, that's more appropriate to like the sin and salvation issue, not so much as like, not
work
so
is
much
really
as,
stressful.
yeah, a stressful situation. And people always say God won't give you more than you can handle. Yes, he will, because he wants you to rely on him. Like, that's why you go through such bad things, because he doesn't want you to handle it on your own. He wants to take that burden from you.
So, do you think other Christian traditions would probably find your definition of salvation uh, surprising?
I think I don't think they would find it surprising, but there are a lot of Christian beliefs, like different denominations and sects, that will disagree because of the dispensational differences in like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's like, no, you have to be baptized to be saved. If you're not baptized, you're going to hell. Or you have to be as good as you can be, or that's gonna hurt you in the end. And like a lot of different things, a lot of different people, you have to be in our specific church or you won't actually be saved.
Hmm.
um, a lot of different beliefs out there, but I think in my eyes, it's the simplest way, like reading Paul's letters. It's just the free grace of God, and you just have to trust it, and that's it. And I did mention the mindfulness thing. I'll get to that probably in a different episode, because
Oh yeah, we'll probably
mindfulness
have
is
a
a way of,
mindfulness episode or something.
yeah, that might be a good idea, actually. Yeah, let's do that. Do
All right.
you have a question, Brittany?
So you kind of talked about the inevitability of, so God knew that humans would sin, like that Adam would sin. So I
Yeah.
guess maybe this is like a basic question, but like if he knew that that was going to happen, is it because he had this redemptive plan that he still went along with it? Like why did he, like why didn't he like come up with a different plan or something where like humans didn't sin? Like why did humans have to sin? Like if he knew they were going to.
Well, his plan wasn't for man to sin, but I think because he knew, like, the inevitability of it, that he made a plan before he even, like, made the earth. And there's a whole background to it, because he has a twofold plan to dwell on the earth and the heavens. And the plan for the heavens was never made known to man, because he didn't want Satan to know until it was revealed to Paul, because Satan was just so focused on taking the earth back. And this goes back to some cosmology stuff, um, that Satan was on an original earth, and it's kind of like a gap theory thing, um, if you uh, if you understand what that is. But God wanted to take back the earth, but he also wanted to take back the heavens. Lucifer, or Satan, didn't know about that, and probably still trying to figure out when the world is happening because of Paul, because that was never foretold of, because everything in the Bible is prophesied except for Paul's writings and Paul's doctrine, and like that threw a loop in Satan's plan. But the redemption of mankind was always seen throughout history, and God is doing this for a specific reason, according to his plan. Like, let's it's basically like he's, like, age by age, like different ways he's dealing with man is teaches us a different lesson about mankind. Like, we can know good and evil, but we're still not going to do good. We can have a government set up to help us with that, but that's still not going to do any good. We can have a law written down on stone right in front of us, and that's still not going to do any good. And it's really to help us realize that we always will need God. So in the end, we don't forsake our relationship with God.
Could you say that it's almost the the idea that like humans sin and will and there's this salvation aspect at the end? Could you say that that's almost like God's creative process of creating us to be, I don't know.
To be conformed to his image.
Yeah, so it's like this is like, God created, everything, like God created humans, but maybe I don't know if created is like is the right tense. Like maybe could you like say that it's still a part of the creative process?
That's actually very true, because Paul does talk about how we are, like, somehow in the spiritual realm, which is very real. It's not like a ghostly, like, abstract thing. We are made, like, we are a new man, like literally a new creation, like under that salvation. It's he's I think it was part of like a being created kind of process, in a way. Like, we are being created as the body of Christ. Like, we are new men, like, one new man. Like, it's being created is kind of a good way to put it.
Not
I
like
don't think,
not like creative, like, ooh, I'm gonna come up with something, but like the act of creating is still
yeah,
almost like a dynamic ongoing process or something.
right.
Or
And I
maybe like
think,
one of those like domino things where it's like he set it up and now it's just like going through the necessary growing process or something.
In a way, very much so, yeah. Because I think again, there's this plan that he has, and it is to get to a specific point. But I don't think he would have created man. Going back to like, why didn't he just make a different like plan? Um, he wants man, just like the angels, to have that free will, to have that choice, and he doesn't want a creation that is forced to love him, like that is made, okay, you will love me, because that's not what love is. Love is not force, it's a choice. So either way, he is going to have that choice available to his creation, or it's not love, and God is love. So I think it might have been almost impossible to not give that 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 creation that choice and that love, especially when you look at what the responsibility of the angelic realm and now given to mankind, like what we were supposed to be doing. Like we had to have that choice, or it would have been impossible to really have in place.
It's so it's kind of like it is an absolutely necessary part of the process.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah,
couldn't have a plan where people were forced, like, you know, forced or whatever, because that's not how it works. So there's almost like a necessity for
right.
things to play out as they have.
Yeah, I'm not going to be happy with a relationship with a robot, because even if I make it as like as human as possible, like it still has a programming that I put in it to like me and like to not hate me if I program it that way. But like having an actual person to have a love relationship with, like is like just seeing that from a human point of view, that's like so much more rewarding, and like that's what I would want out of a relationship with someone.
Yeah.
So I
That makes
think in a
sense.
way that applies to God. I'm not sure, you know, I don't know how much more it is to him. And again, we're only told what we're told in the Bible, but his plan is all throughout that, and I think there's some good detail and like hints of what that's supposed to look like. But that's a good question.
Did that answer?
Yeah, it
Okay.
also like brought up so many more questions, but we don't have to. We can talk about that some other time. I do have an episode suggestion.
Oh yeah.
If you don't already have this planned out, maybe um like Destiny sort of themed, maybe not Destiny, but like I don't know what the right word
Like,
is.
what's
Like
the reason for it all?
maybe not for it all, but like how things play out.
Okay, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Okay,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Like fate versus.
Yeah, because you talked about a lot about plans and how things
Yeah.
play out. So, like, from your side, what role does God have in the way things play out? Like, what like the more subtleties of God's, because he's omnipotent. So, how
Hmm.
does he? What role does he play in how? Um, yeah, how things play out.
Yeah,
So
I would love to talk about that. Like the overarching like what is he doing kind of thing,
yeah, I would
and
be
how does
very
he do it?
interested
Yeah.
in an episode like that.
That
Yeah,
and
definitely.
it would it would be really interesting seeing the contrast
Yeah,
between
definitely.
the Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to.
Speaking of which,
Yeah, what's your story? What's your side of thing?
so so you talked about salvation and sin, or sin and salvation, um, and from a Buddhist perspective, it's not quite uh, the same thing, as you could probably surmise.
Right.
But so, from a Buddhist perspective, we have this idea of dukkha, or suffering, which could be like the comparative religion equivalent to sin. if you were to make a chart or something.
Yeah.
And liberation would be the comparison, the equivalent of salvation.
Right.
But they are also very vastly different. So we talk about. So it seems like it would make sense if I started talking about suffering first, but I don't think I will. I think I'll touch on like liberation first, or nibbana or nirvana. Some people will use enlightenment as well, although some people actually kind of differentiate the two, but I won't for the sake of simplicity. But so the reason why I want to start with liberation is because kind of explaining why there's like this goal of liberation to begin with. And so a lot of people kind of equate or kind of use this metaphor with Buddhism, as the Buddha was like kind of acted as a doctor. So he first diagnosed the problem with humanity, specifically with why we suffer, why there's dukkha, why are things unreliable, why are things unsatisfactory. And it ties, like if you look at the story of the Buddha's life, it really illustrates kind of in a metaphorical, allegorical sense what he's getting at. And so in the story of his life, when he leaves the palace as a young man for the first time, he grew up very sheltered in this palace. His father made sure that he would never experience suffering. So he lived a very indulgent, pleasurable life. But he got curious about what's on the outside. And so he left his palace on several occasions, and what he saw dismayed him and confused him, because he saw what people will sometimes refer to as like the 3 or the 4 divine messengers. And they weren't an actual like divine messenger, but they gave him a message that really blew his mind. And so the first one he saw was a sick person, and he told his attendant, like, what is this? What's wrong with this person? He's like, the Buddha never, or the Bodhisattva, before he was enlightened, he was never sick. So because his father, made sure he would never experience unsatisfactory, illness or anything. So it's like, oh, well, that person's sick. That's what happens to us. We get sick. And he's like, what? And so the second one was an old person. And he's like, what's wrong with them? And his attendant said, well, they're old. That's what happens. That's what happens to us. And then the third one was a dead body, usually described as like bloated and decaying on the side of the road, or in a funeral procession. And he's like, what's wrong with that person? And his attendant says, well, they're dead. That's what happens to us. And this was news to him. He's like, wow. And he goes back, and there's this great concept in Buddhism that I love called Samvega. And it's this kind of distraught, like dismayed realization of the futility of trying to get pleasure and satisfaction out of things. Maybe that's probably not quite like an official definition, but like it's this like realization, kind of like, wow, like, uh-oh. And so he goes back to his palace, and he looks around, he's like, wow, none of this matters. Like I've tried, like my father has tried for my whole life to keep me from suffering, but look outside, like that is happening, that is inevitable. And so he began to question, why do we, like, where does this suffering come from? Why are we experiencing this? And more importantly, what can we do about it? Because obviously, indulging in this palace full of wonders and sense pleasures, like, is not the answer. And so he left home to figure it out. He thought, there's got to be something. And the fourth divine messenger he sees is a mendicant, a an ascetic practitioner of spirituality. You know, one of the practitioners in their loincloths or whatever. And he's like, that guy seems to be like pretty at ease. I wonder why. And so he underwent years of spiritual practice and training, and he had many teachers and many practices of which he implemented into Buddhism, but from what might be considered a more skillful approach. And it was years of practicing these ascetic practices of like self-mortification and self-denial, and almost like a self-punishment in a way, that he realized, wait a minute, this isn't working either. Like, I'm the story goes that he has undergone this very rigid practice of not even eating but a single grain of rice a day, and he's like just completely like just skin and bone. He said if he touched his stomach, he could feel his spine, and like he's sitting there lethargic, completely out of energy, and realizing, wait a minute, this is like, I tried to get away from this indulgent lifestyle that obviously wasn't helping my suffering, but what is this? What am I doing now? The same thing, like the exact opposite, but the same thing. Like, there's still suffering, there's still a dissatisfaction. And that's where he discovered the middle way between hedonistic indulgence and rigid, austere, harmful practices. And then he sat under the Bodhi tree and realized the path to the cessation of suffering. And so people say that he's in a kind of a doctor in a way, because he diagnosed, okay, there's a problem with suffering, and then how do we figure out, okay, what's causing this suffering, and then is there a way to stop this suffering, and then the prescription, the eightfold path. And this is what makes up the Four Noble Truths. He saw that there was suffering. That's the first truth. The second truth is where it comes from. It comes from clinging. It comes from ignorance of suffering. Okay, is there a way to stop it? Yes, there is. That's the third truth, the cessation of suffering. And the fourth truth is, okay, how? And so he pieced it together and discovered this way. And as the stories go, discovered that way under the Bodhi tree, and attained liberation from suffering. So liberation is, very simply put, the cessation of suffering, the cessation of dukkha. And how to reach that is a little more difficult, and we might want to understand what dukkha and what this suffering really is. And as I said, like, this suffering comes from clinging, and this really, at the core of it, clinging is forming at the most subtle levels, forming an idea of self with things that are not self. And what is not, I mean, I want to say what is not self, but like everything is not self. But so we get this mistaken notion of it's almost a misinterpretation of how we relate to the world around us and how we relate to ourselves. And so we start experiencing phenomena and coming up with these ideas of how it relates to us versus I don't know about verses, but how it relates to us and how maybe it's a part of us. And then the suffering comes into play when it turns out it's not, what we've identified with fails to live up to that selfness, because whoops, it's not self, and it's also changing, it's impermanent. So, and then that's where the ignorance comes into play, because the ignorance is the mistaken notion that there is this selfness and this permanence, this reliability. And the suffering comes into play when it turns out to be the opposite, and we're left confused. Whoa, why is this not working? And unreliability, suffering is kind of a drastic word to use for it, but like unsatisfaction, unreliability, I really like those. Sometimes unease, and so liberation comes about when we train our minds to stop clinging to these notions, stop these habitual acts of identifying self with things that are not self. And the Buddha describes the 5 major components to what we view as self, which is known as the 5 aggregates. And I won't get into them too much, but like it's like the physical body, and also perception and consciousness, and but as I said, I won't get into that. But those are the 5 things we really identify with that are not self, that ultimately disappoints us. Disappointment is another good word for dukkha. And so how do we liberate ourselves from suffering?
Right back.
Okay. I'll time out. Or do you want me to keep talking?
No, you can keep going.
Okay. So how do we liberate ourselves from suffering? I mean, simply put, it's ceasing the clinging, but that's easier said than done. And it's called a practice for a reason, because it's a practice of it really is kind of unlearning our habituations of selfing, if you will. And that's what the Eightfold Path is about. It's a structure that helps us realign our lives with the truth of suffering, of unreliability, of and the selflessness and the impermanence of things. And so he sets up the structure of practice aimed at the ending of suffering with kind of 3 aspects. And that would be like a wisdom or insight aspect, an ethical aspect, and a meditative aspect. And this is what the Eightfold Path is. And so the wisdom aspect is like right understanding, or skillful understanding. Right is kind of a problematic word in that sense, but sometimes wholesome understanding versus unwholesome, and also skillful thought, and then like the ethical practices are like skillful speech, action, and livelihood. And then the meditative aspects is a right effort, or skillful effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And all these 8 pieces form the foundation, and it's usually depicted as an 8-spoked wheel. And so these 8 aspects, these 8 dimensions help create the foundation of the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. And it's interesting, it's worth pointing out, because sometimes it seems like so contrived, like, wow, there's a way to this ultimate truth with very specific tools, and sometimes it could seem a little, it could throw you off a little, but they are very specifically designed tools to get you to a very specific goal. I mean, the Buddha never bothered with questions of the existence of a god, or of I don't know, several different, like, you could think of like different philosophical conundrums that seem worthy of a religion forming around. And the Buddha's like, no, I have only ever taught suffering and the cessation of suffering. That's his main concern, and that's like really what he pinpoints as like the ultimate concern. Because when you apply that model to pretty much anything else, like, it makes it kind of nullifies other concerns in a way. That's just my opinion on the matter. But the thing that's worthy of pointing out is that the cessation of suffering is rooted in the idea of kind of liberation, of release, of letting go. And the very last thing one lets go of when they reach the other shore of enlightenment is the practice itself. And he uses the idea, because the Buddha and Buddhism has always been like almost annoyingly pragmatic and practical. And so he says, this practice, undertake it like a raft. When you get to the other shore, there's no use carrying it further. You abandon it when you reach that point. And so
that's really interesting.
So some people will say like, oh, the practice is the goal. But I don't think that's necessarily true. Because sometimes you get in like maybe like Zen circles or something where like the practice of, I mean, you are like in a sense practicing letting go with these practices. And so I mean, I can agree. I can see why someone would say that the path is the goal, but there's also this idea of when reaching the goal, the path is let go as well. So yeah, I like that raft analogy.
That is pretty interesting.
But yeah, so
I never really thought of it that way from like a Buddhist perspective. Like you basically have to like in the end forsake the practice.
Yeah, and you're not forsaking it, but it's like, again, it goes back to the practical thing. Like, you've used this tool, and now like once you get the screw in, you put the screwdriver down. It's not gonna help you.
Yeah.
You just end up looking kind of silly, like carrying around the screwdriver. Like, I did it.
But I love it.
Yeah, and that's
attachment
clinging
right
there.
Yeah.
That's attachment.
Yep.
But I love it. I want to keep it. And yeah, and like
I have a comparative thing
Yeah.
to bring up with that. Like that's a really like I can apply that kind of, I can see that from like a Christian perspective, even though like that would be just like one facet of like if you go to like a bookstore, there's going to be like a Christian living uh section, and that's like, what are we doing in this life? And like, you know, you're suffering because of the sin in your life, and there is a way to let go, because you know, in the Christian perspective, we're like, even though like I'm a saved born again person, like, you know, the Holy Spirit's indwelling me, I'm still living in this body, this vessel of flesh, and the flesh has like almost a, I guess it would be more of the spirit of man, and like the flesh driving that to want to go back to the things that make you miserable. Like, it's kind of, I think it is going back almost to like Satan's pride, and how you just care about yourself, and like your desires, not necessarily your like health, but like your desires and your like fleshly wants. Like, I'll just go back to this sin that I always wanted, because it's comfortable and it's like self-gratifying. But like after, like in the end, it's like, man, why did I do that? I'm so stupid. Like, you're just like continuing your your battle that's making you miserable, and you know, suffering basically.
Yeah.
And and from the biblical view, like, to be able to let go of that, you know, there's that common refrain, walk in the spirit, not in the flesh. Like, walk not in the flesh. um you know, walk by faith, not by sight. Like, walk by the spiritual realm, not the physical realm. And uh you know, I think Paul says like things in this world are just temporary or temporal, and but things in the spiritual realm are more eternal. Like, that's the stuff that really matters. So like, even though we're still like in this body of flesh, like I'm hungry right now. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to suffer. Like, I can feed myself and not have that, like, a spirit of gluttony, um,
Mhm.
which will make me suffer. Like, man, I ate way too much. Like, maybe you should control yourself a little bit, because gluttony is a sin. I don't really follow like the seven deadly sins that like the Catholic Church kind of perpetuates, but like, gluttony is a listed sin in the Bible, and there's lots of different sins in the Bible. But um,
I like what you said, like the self-gratifying, like you go back to these, I don't know if you said you go back to these sins or whatever. And like
vices, like, you go back to the
vices,
vices. Yeah.
yes. And there's like this, like whenever like the idea of sin is brought up in Buddhism, like it's always emphasized that like the popular idea of sin like doesn't really exist in Buddhism. Um, and that's why I said right. The word right was like kind of problematic because of the implications. But in Buddhism, when you hear right or wrong, and better yet, skillful or unskillful, or wholesome or unwholesome, even though that even is a little problematic sometimes, there's like this clear distinction of like what is a skillful thing versus unskillful. Well, it skillful is that which helps guide you to a more liberated life, um, and in like less like, I guess, less Buddhist way of putting it, skillful things, skillful actions, and skillful thoughts like help you live a happier life.
Would
Um,
that be, would it be applicable to say like skillful is like kind of intentional, and like
Intentional is part of
with,
it, but not all of it. Um,
okay.
but skillful is like it's it. You know, I'm trying to think of like a practical, real world like metaphor, kind of like, I don't know. It's like if your TV screen is messing up or something, it's not inherently bad to hit it, like, but it's not going to help.
Okay,
Like,
okay.
beneficial is all another word. Like, what is beneficial versus what is non-beneficial? So it's like, what, practicality goes back to the pragmatism. What actually helps go that direction? What actually helps mitigate and end suffering?
That's I like that because from a biblical point of view, that's almost the same as like in the age of grace, because like nothing we can do can remove our redemption. We can't lose it. We're sealed unto the day of redemption, but like we should still be wise about things we do, and like the whole thing about like what's beneficial is like very appropriate to apply to that. Like whatever edifies, like you should do that. Like don't do something that's not going to be beneficial to not only yourself but like others, other walks as well. Like they say, like if something offends a brother, don't do it. Like at least not when you're around them. Like just don't do it. Like you don't want them to stumble. But there are other verses that say like whether you eat or whether I think whether you eat or drink, like do it unto the Lord. But I'm actually trying to think of whether you live, you are the Lord's. Whatever you die, or when, like whether you die, whether you live or die, you are the Lord. So like whatever you do, like do it like again with intention, and if it's beneficial, like for where like what direction you're going, like
Yeah,
be mindful about that fact.
yeah, and like going back again to the phrasing self gratifying that you used is like is is perfect because the unskillful things, the unskillful ways of being are inherently self-gratifying. What is unskillful? Well, it's things that are building up this sense of self, this this mistaken notion of of an individual independently, existing kind of. And like, so of course you will go to your vices, and gratify the self, kind of build up this idea, um, and of, oh, what will bring me happiness. And so like, overeating or something, like, oh man, I shouldn't have eaten all that. Like that's a good, uh like, kind of analogy to play with, because like eating isn't inherently unskillful, but it's how you approach it and what, like, your intentions behind it,
Hmm.
like if you're, oh, I'm gonna eat 5 pieces of cake because that sounds so good and I'm pretty sure that'll make me happy, like, and then you eat it and then, oh, dukkha, like, like,
Oh, Dukkha.
yeah, it's like you have that regret afterwards, like, oh
And you
wow, that,
know that you've done it before, but
yeah,
you're like, maybe this time will be different. And like
yeah,
in some
that's samsara.
cases, like you become numb to that fact, and you forget that you're
You're
actually
ignorant.
like suffering
It's
from
the
that
delusion.
suffering those consequences. Um, and like
Yeah,
you forget that you shouldn't be doing that.
yeah, I mean, a that's like the ignorance part, like, the
Hmm.
delusion is the kind of a forgetfulness of, oh
Yeah.
yeah, that didn't work.
And that you saying that ignorance reminded me of this sermon that I did once a long time ago, and I made sin an acronym of selfishness, and it went back to Lucifer, like I will, like this is my like time to shine, like, and then the I is ignorance, and the Bible talks about people being willfully ignorant, like they are like ignorant on purpose.
Mm.
Maybe they don't like, I don't want to think that think about that it's going to make me feel horrible if I eat this
Aversion.
whole cake. Yeah, and then N is numbness. Like if you continue those patterns, like you're just going to become numb to the fact that like you're going to regret this, and like you almost hide the regret and stop regretting it, and you just like let it take over.
And
And
so the
like,
cycle continues.
yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
in Buddhism, we have the 12 links of a dependent origination, which shows you where suffering comes from. And it always begins with ignorance and goes all the way around to suffering. And from suffering comes ignorance. And so
Hmm.
it loops, it's a feedback loop. The more you suffer, the more you kind of forget. And it's not like it builds up, but like continues
Right.
until you are able to like combat that forgetfulness.
Hmm. Yeah, I see a lot of comparisons there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think like in the Christian circles, it's more of like one part of like the Christian living, since we're unfortunately in this world, like this is what we're gonna have to deal with. So, um, yeah, definitely a lot applicable there.
Yeah.
But I think we're running out of time.
Yeah.
I think there's been some awesome conversations that we're definitely going to revisit some of those topics. But I think
Oh, yeah,
for now,
definitely.
that's any closing words at all on this topic at all, or I think I've said my cliff notes
Yeah,
pieces of it.
I
So
think I've covered everything that I claimed to have claimed to want to cover.
okay.
Suffering and liberation. I think I covered some of that. Maybe not
Right.
liberation as much, but
And you know, that same thing came to mind as well when I was talking about sin and salvation. Like I touched on like what sin is, what salvation is, but like what does that mean to the saved person? What
yeah,
does that what are the consequences? That's going to be a destiny topic or something. Because
yeah.
that's a whole nother episode
Oh
right
yeah,
there.
totally.
Awesome. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up.
Cool. Yeah.
So thank you all for listening and watching. Um, we're going to be back in the next episode for more awesome conversations, more in-depth conversations and whatnot. So this has been the Baptist
And the Buddhist.
with Mark
And Brian.
and Brittany in the background.
And Brittany in the background.
Thanks
The
everyone.
background Brittany.
Yes. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you later.
See you later.